Everybody knew old Miss Robbins was a vampire. Our parents dismissed it as childish paranoia, but we had proof. The first piece of evidence: she almost never left her house, and when she did, it was never during the daytime. The second: she was always draped in black, as if mourning something ancient and forgotten. The most chilling evidence, though, came from Billie Atkins, who swore he once saw her sitting on her porch at dawn. As the first rays of sunlight crept over the horizon, she clutched her chest like she'd been stabbed and fled inside. At first, having a vampire in the neighborhood wasn't too terrible. During the day, we were safe. At night, we stayed locked indoors, certain she couldn't come in unless invited. But things began to change. Miss Robbins started venturing out more often. She'd only come out at night, and at first, she wouldn't leave her yard. She'd stand there, unmoving, staring into the darkness. Slowly, she'd reach into her pocket and pull out a ring of keys, rattling them softly, as if to soothe something unseen. The sound carried eerily in the still night air, sending shivers up our spines. Sometimes she stayed out until the sun threatened to rise. Then, clutching her chest, she'd retreat into her house. Each night, she edged closer to the street. First, she was 15 feet away. A few nights later, she was 10, then 5. The closer she got, the more aggressively she rattled the keys, until even the neighborhood dogs began barking at her. But Miss Robbins didn't flinch. She just stood there, her keys clinking like an unsettling lullaby. That's when Billy came up with a plan. "We'll sneak into her house," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "All vampires sleep in coffins, right? If we can get a picture, they'll have to believe us." We drew straws to see who would be the one to go. Of course, I pulled the short one. The next night, as Miss Robbins stood on her lawn, rattling those keys, I crept through her front door. It was wide open, as if she knew someone would eventually come. Inside, the air was heavy and stifling. The smell of mothballs mixed with something metallic hung thick, clinging to my skin. My phone trembled in my hand as I started searching for her coffin. The living room was empty, save for furniture covered in sheets like forgotten ghosts. The bedroom was next. Each step down the hall felt like dragging my feet through quicksand. I pushed the door open, its creak cutting through the silence. No coffin there either. That left the basement. The basement door was in the laundry room, its peeling paint barely hanging on. Sweat dripped down my face as I stared at it, my breath catching in my throat. My hand shook as I pushed it open and turned on my phone's flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness but only reached halfway down the stairs. I took a step down, then another. The sound of the front door slamming shut froze me in place. Heavy, deliberate footsteps echoed above me. My heart thundered in my chest as I eased the basement door closed and crouched, pressing myself against the wall. My foot slipped on a loose step and I fell, tumbling into the darkness. My phone hit the ground, the screen shattering but the light staying on. Dazed, I swept the beam of light around the room. The light caught something on a shelf, a collection of jars. Each one was filled with a murky, greenish liquid. Shapes floated inside, distorted by the grime-coated glass. I squinted, my stomach churning as the flashlight settled on one. It was a hand. Small, shriveled, and gray. Before I could scream, the keys started rattling again, this time from the top of the basement stairs. I saw what was inside the glass jars. A scream swelled in my throat, but escaped as a strangled whimper. Even that was too loud. The basement door creaked open, flooding the room with light. "Who's there?" Miss Robbins' voice was sharp, cutting through the silence like a knife. My head whipped around, searching frantically for another way out. There wasn't one. The only exit was the stairs, and Miss Robbins stood between me and them. The beam of her flashlight swept the room, catching me square in the eyes. I dropped to my knees, blinded by the searing light. "Please," I whispered, trembling. "Please don't kill me." I heard a sharp click, and suddenly the overhead light flickered on. I dared not look toward the shelf where the jars stood. "So," Miss Robbins said, her tone almost amused, "you found my children." I swallowed hard, my throat dry. I won't tell anyone. I swear." Miss Robbins chuckled, low and humorless. "I'd prefer if you didn't," she said, stepping into the room. "But you're not in any danger." She walked over to the jars and rested a frail, bony hand on one. Her gaze softened as she stared at it, a shadow of something like sadness crossing her face. "These were the only children I ever had," she said, her voice quiet. "None of them made it out alive." My eyes flicked to the jars despite myself, and the realization hit me like a punch to the stomach. They weren't children. They were fetuses, twisted and grotesque, suspended in murky liquid. In the dark, they had looked so much larger. "Come on, boy," Miss Robbins said suddenly, her voice breaking the spell. "Have some tea with me. I won't tell your parents you were here." Without waiting for a response, she turned and climbed the stairs. Her steps were slow but deliberate. After a moment's hesitation, I followed, the stench of the basement still clinging to my clothes. Upstairs, the air was thick with the scent of something floral. Miss Robbins shuffled into the kitchen and motioned for me to sit at a worn wooden table. She busied herself with an old red kettle, her movements shaky. A few minutes later, we were sipping rose petal tea from delicate china cups. Her hands trembled as she lifted her cup, her gnarled fingers barely steady enough to hold it. "Miss Robbins?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Yes, boy? You said those were your children?" Her eyes flickered with something I couldn't place, regret, perhaps, or pain. She sighed, shifting uncomfortably in her chair. "That's right," she said. How come they came out like that?" Her gaze darkened. "All twisted up and deformed, you mean?" I nodded, my face burning. She set her cup down with a soft clink. "My father wasn't good to me or my sisters," she said after a long pause. "He hurt us in ways no one should be hurt. Messed up my insides, years later when I tried to have kids. Well, none of them survived." "I'm sorry," I whispered. "So am I," she replied. We sat in silence for a while, the only sound the faint ticking of a clock. Finally, I spoke again. "Miss Robbins?" "Yes, boy?" "You said you had sisters?" "I did," she said, her voice heavy. "3 of them. Now I've only got one." "How come she doesn't visit you?" Miss Robbins stared into her tea, her expression unreadable. "I shouldn't be telling you any of this," she said. "But I suppose when someone finally talks to an old woman like me, we can't help but spill our whole life story." She took another shaky sip of tea before continuing. "This house," she said, gesturing around her, "is where I grew up. My sisters all moved away, lived their lives, but I could never leave." "Why not?" I asked. "They didn't have a name for it back then," she said. "Now they call it agoraphobia. Too much open space, too much noise, too many people. I can't handle it. I can make it as far as the lawn some nights, but when the daylight comes..." She trailed off, shaking her head. "But you've been going out every night," I said. "I've seen you." She stirred her tea, her expression troubled. "My sister is dying," she said softly. "They say she's got a few months left. It's my last chance to see her before she goes. Why do you rattle your keys?" "They're my car keys," she said, smiling faintly. "But it's been years since I drove. I'm fooling myself, really. Even if I made it to the car, it wouldn't start." I hesitated before blurting out, "We thought you were a vampire." For a moment, Miss Robbins stared at me, unblinking. Then, to my surprise, she laughed a deep, hearty laugh that filled the room. "I suppose that makes more sense than being afraid of the outside," I said. Miss Robbins tilted her head slightly, her soft smile barely masking the deeper sadness. "Does it?" "Well, sure," I replied. "Everybody's heard of vampires. But agoraphobia? I don't think anyone really knows what that is." "Agoraphobia," she repeated, her voice like a sigh, the faint smile fading. "Right," I said. "But Miss Robbins..." "Yes?" How can anyone be afraid of the outside? Her lips tightened into a thin, troubled line. Fear isn't always about what's outside, boy, she said. Her voice dropped, carrying a weight that made the room feel colder. Sometimes it's about what's waiting inside. I didn't know what to say, so I stayed quiet. Miss Robbins leaned forward, her eyes shadowed under the dim light. If there's one thing I've learned, she continued, her voice low and steady, it's that living in fear is like standing under an avalanche. The snow just keeps falling, piling higher and higher. If you don't move, eventually you'll be buried, trapped, unable to breathe, unable to claw your way out. I shivered, goosebumps prickling my skin. It's a shame you're not a vampire, I said, trying to lighten the mood. Her brow furrowed slightly, and her voice took on an amused but wary tone. And why's that? Well, if you were a vampire, you wouldn't have to be afraid. I don't think there's anything out there tougher than a vampire. She chuckled softly, but it wasn't the warm sound I'd expected. Is that so? Sure. And anyway, Billy says vampires can't go out in sunlight, but I figured they could just wear sunblock. Her smile returned, but it didn't reach her eyes. Yes, she said quietly. I suppose they could. I went home not long after, my mind swimming with the strange conversation. But that wasn't the last time I visited Miss Robbins. Once we were sure she wasn't a vampire, me and the other kids started stopping by her house. She'd make us rose petal tea with honey. Its warmth and sweetness a comfort I've never found since. The very last time I went to Miss Robbins' house, she wasn't there. Instead, a note was pinned to the door, written in her shaky handwriting. I've decided to be a vampire. Her car was gone. Her neighbors said she'd moved out to the Midwest to be with her sister. She passed away out there a few years after her sister did. I didn't know Miss Robbins for very long, but she left an impression on me that's never faded. Every time I feel fear creeping in, threatening to bury me, I think of her, of the woman who once stood paralyzed on her lawn and then one day decided to be a vampire.